Welcome to Windows on the World. This week we're going to be talking about TTIP and CETA. Now, TTIP is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. It's a comprehensive economic trade agreement which affects everybody in this country. More importantly, though, is CETA, which is another agreement which is due to be imposed on us basically very imminently. I'm in the studio with Tim Flitcroft, and we're going to talk about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and especially CETA, which is imminent. So Tim, welcome to Windows on the World.
Hello.
Hi. So can you give us a background of what this is about?
Yes, well, it's good to perhaps reflect on what the origins of these trade agreements is. It wasn't by consumers and people in this country saying, hey, we want to get a better deal with the USA. It was all started by business lobbies way back in the 1990s. And it's the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. It's a close. They invited certain groups, certain CEOs in big companies to form this plan to get improved trade regulation, and involves anyone who's affected by the kind of changes in regulations and our labour rights, our environmental rights, our health rights, our food standards. So the stakeholders in this case is civil society as a whole. And to give you one very small snippet about how it's being conducted, so when the EU has been conducting consultations, 90%, by its own figures, 90% of the consultations have been with big business, and only 10% with civil society. When you think about it, the big companies can pay to employ lobbyists in Brussels. You know, they're working round the clock, these guys. You know, we don't have anything like that kind of level of representation or financial power. So, but the lobbying happens at a lot of different levels. It happens directly through government, it happens via the City of London, it happens on the EU Commission. So it happens at all different points in the chain. It's not just one simple thing.
Basically, it's going to be arbitrated outside the jurisdiction of the country where the trade's happening. Is that right?
Yes, so I think what you're referring to is the investor-state dispute settlement.
Yes.
Now this, I think it's useful to think of it in two senses. One as a principle, and secondly as how that principle is actually brought into practice. Yeah. So the ISDS, the principle is that corporations can sue governments if their profits, or even their future profits, as yet sort of realised, are threatened. Yeah. So, for example, you know, just to give you one quick one, Lone Pine are suing Ottawa, I think it is Ottawa, because they wanted to put a moratorium on fracking under the St. Lawrence River. They haven't actually started, but for loss of future profits, they're suing them for something like 250 million. So it's the kind of things that go on. Now, that's the principle that corporations can sue governments. It doesn't work the other way around. So if corporations behave badly, you know, sectors in civil society, trade unions or consumer groups or governments themselves can't sue them. They can only have recourse to normal legal procedures. They can't use these special mechanisms. And one of the crucial things I think to understand is okay, so then that's the principle. Then the application has been heavily criticised, and there have been some slight modifications of it by Malmstrom, and now it's called the International Court System.
Yes.
So to make very clear, the principle remains. That principle is untouched. That doesn't so. Most people would say it's just window dressing, and it makes a few minor changes about how the arbitrators are chosen. They're now called judges. The arbitration tribunal is now called the court, but really that's just name changing. Yeah. And things like most favoured nation treatment mean that if a government is suing a country, it can also invoke clauses in treaties that it hasn't, any treaty that nation has made, it can invoke those clauses as well.
So basically what they've got is access to any law or kind of jurisdiction that they want to use within the framework of the claim.
Yeah, it's much wider than people think. Yeah. I think one of the problems about the whole TTIP thing, and in this area in particular, is the wording is quite loose. Yes. And although it might look kind of reasonable at a brief glance, when it goes before an arbitration tribunal, it's going to be picked pieces. So Another one is manifest arbitrariness. And Philip Morris used that very particular clause to sue Australia about its tobacco packaging policies. It said, oh, well, you could have done other things. You could have just warned people, or you could have done
These
this.
are to do with the photographs. These
Yes,
photographs
yes.
that they put on of people's lungs being
Yes.
full of cancer, basically,
Yes.
and their last gasps as victims of smoking.
Yes.
So Philip Morris appealed against that, and
Yes.
they successfully sued the Australian government.
Well, it didn't quite work out like that. I think that's a very important thing for people to get, that a phrase like manifest arbitrariness can be interpreted by lawyers in all sorts of which ways. It really means that anything you do can be interpreted as manifestly arbitrary. I mean, how can you defend against that on a legal thing? And you've got to remember these tribunals, because they're not courts, I'm sorry, they're tribunals run by arbitrators. I mean, you can call them judges. The people who are doing the judging are paid by case, actually on £3,000 a day. So obviously they're going to be, on the whole, slightly simpatico to the people who are bringing the cases, because if the people don't bring the cases, they're out of a job.
Yeah.
So it's completely loaded. I mean, it'd be like having a criminal case where, you know, it's in the favour of the criminals, you know, because they're bringing the cases, you know. I mean, it's a kind of, well, there's no very good example, but it's a kind of a complete bias against it. Now, the additional things about the Philip Morris thing was, too, it didn't succeed, that particular thing, not because of the substance, but because of a technical legality about how Philip Morris was suing. It didn't sue directly from America, it sued via, I think, a Hong Kong-Australia treaty. And it even moved its assets over to Hong Kong in order to be under this treaty. But it hadn't done it for the right amount of time. So it was thrown out on a legality.
But if this comes in, companies will be able to plan for that.
Well, this treaty shopping thing, they've tried to reduce it, but I mean, I think companies will get around it. I mean, like, one of the dangers about CETA that we ought to address is that 42,000 companies, that's 85% of US companies, are fully registered in Canada.
Yeah.
That's not just a letterbox company, they're eligible to operate. So that means that when we're shaking hands with Canada, we're shaking hands with the US.
Yes.
And we're shaking hands with people like Monsanto who want to get GM into our food. Those are the people we're shaking hands with. It's not nice, friendly Canada, you know, who we like to think of. Canada has vastly changed since NAFTA. It's virtually become, it's the national, what is it actually? It's the National American Free Trade Agreement.
Trade Association.
It's basically between Canada, the US and Mexico. That's had a devastating effect on Canada. And it has become more or less like one economy with the US. So CETA is very dangerous in that respect.
Yeah. It says here, both TTIP as well as our trade agreement with Canada, CETA, aim to include progressive chapters on sustainable development, including on labour rights and the environment. Now, you referred earlier to the fact that it's going to actually affect the environment. How do you think that will happen?
All right, okay, so the first is that it's going to facilitate the export of tar sands oil from Canada. That's one of the dangerous things. CETA has already had an effect in this respect, that Canada used its negotiating position within CETA to demand that tar sands oil be admitted to EU. Before that, the EU had forbidden it. This is because this tar sands oil is has 23% more greenhouse gas emissions. That's enormous. And when they tried to then maybe put a tax on it to try and inhibit its use, that was regarded as putting in a trade barrier. So these tar sands oil, which are devastating in Canada as well, devastating huge tracts of Alberta, are going to be shipped into the into the EU, and we're not going to be able to do anything about that. So that's one huge one. The analysis is by Friends of the Earth that there will be 11.8 million tonnes of CO2 increased emissions due to these trade treaties.
So really they're going against their own idea of what they're calling sustainable development and the carbon tax. Yeah.
And also things like renewable energy programs will be threatened.
Yeah.
All the elimination of buy local rules that often support sustainable development. As we've already mentioned, the fracking it'll be made much easier to do. So and the regulatory cooperation as well, because it means that if any kind of regulation comes before which might threaten their interests, it can be barred.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting what you brought up there, because they're meant to be doing this on the back of so-called sustainable development. As we know, though, all these treaties, and especially the carbon taxation schemes, are working in the favour of corporates because they just buy their way into it. But that's very, very interesting for the first part of the show. Now, it says here, this is from their website. This is the trade.ec.europa.eu website, which is putting together these treaties, both CETA and TTIP. CETA is pretty much with us, as we've been already stating so far on the show. But Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström stated, this report, being a draft version to be scrutinised, should be taken with a pinch of salt. So nobody really knows what it's going to look like in the end, and there's already 400 pages of it, I believe. It says, but the impact of TTIP on Europe's ability to shape globalisation will be according to its own standards. So again, it's very loose, and it all seems to point to huge corporations taking more and more power. We'll see you after the break. In your opinion, do you think the jury was led?
It's not mine to say.
Very diplomatic. Tell the viewers a bit about what happened to you.
Well, they bribed 3 criminals to come in and give hearsay.
If a bomb went off in London and took 92 lives, yeah, would you want to be on the payroll of that?
It's all based on models and projections.
It's all over bar shouting.
In order to get me in prison, they probably broke, a couple dozen laws.
Free Yolanda. Y'all planted drugs on Yolanda, and we're gonna get her released and get the crooked cops busted.
That gave all the officers time for their adrenaline to slow down so we wouldn't get shot.
Welcome back to Windows on the World. We're talking about TTIP and CETA. Now, TTIP is the US and EU Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and it's being negotiated at the moment. But CETA, which is the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, is actually underway at the moment, and this is going to be brought in before TTIP. Now, if you're thinking, what's that? Probably a good question. We've spent the first part of the show explaining how it will affect us, basically giving corporations right to sue governments. So I'm with Tim, and we're going to carry on the discussion now, and we're going into something called regulatory harmonisation. Can you explain what that is, Tim?
Okay, well, can I just say, first of all, if people are not clear, that CETA has all the elements of TTIP. Yeah. And the reason it's there is as a sort of template for further agreements. That was after the collapse of the attempt to use WTO rules to get a multilateral agreement. They then decided to sort of go through bilaterals. And it's a very crafty sort of system. So they're trying to get one set of bilaterals and then latch it onto the next. I mean, there are problems because there are mismatches between the bilaterals, but you can see their plan is to create a universal. So that's the role of CETA. And we should have really mentioned this in the early part, that TTIP, apart from its big business lobbying, the reason why governments have tied into it is because there's a political dimension going on here, whereby the US wants to sort of lay down what the template should be ahead of China getting its kind of mitts on the. So it's really about, on a larger scale, it's about the shifts in economic balances between Asia and the West, the old thing. So that's a very important thing to understand in the dynamics of all of this, and why Obama came to EU. People think, why did Obama suddenly visit the EU at the end of his presidency? Well, he did that to try and shore up TTIP. But I mean, I don't think it's good. So you're asking about regulatory harmonisation, right? So this is an aspect that's in both CETA and TTIP, and it's a regulatory cooperation forum. It has different names in the different things. Basically, it's a body of corporations that will meet annually or more, where they will review legislation prior to it coming before parliaments. So if they see something that might, say, be a nice protection for health or environment, but it's going to damage their profits, they can then make comments on it or delay it indefinitely. I mean, I don't have the exact cases to hand, but I've heard of cases in the States where they successfully stymied useful public health provisions for over 13 years. They've stopped them coming in due to they have a sort of a system already there over in the States of this kind of cooperative ability to review legislation prior. But the trouble about it also is that it creates a regulatory chill. So even if in fact, we will never even know. These are not public. Again, these are not public sort of open scrutiny forums. So we will never know that, say, a law was being brought in. For example, plain cigarette packaging was being proposed in England by Cameron, but it's disappeared. We don't fully understand how that's disappeared. And of course, the forum yet hasn't come in place, but it's an example of what could happen. We'll never know that legislation would have been proposed because it would have been killed off even before it's proposed. So they will actually see that thing. But then also you need to think about some of the other aspects of harmonisation. One of the other aspects is how do we harmonise our standards? Now, there's two different principles at stake here. In Europe, we have the precautionary principle, which means that something can't be used until it's proved to be safe. Okay, that does have its problems because always you can never know quite, but it's a very laudable aim. Now, in the States, it's allowed to be used unless it's proved to be harmful. The opposite thing. Now, and they call this more scientific. Well, it is, I suppose, in the sense that it has actually happened. So it is scientific in that sense. But the problem about it, A, is the damage has already happened. So in the case of a pharmaceutical or something, it could have damaged millions of people. In case of fracking, it can poison water supplies. So the damage already occurs, and then you start dealing with it. Yeah. Now that seems to me pretty insane. I mean, if you have the ability to start analysing a situation before, you should try and analyse it to be as safe as possible. And the two further points about this, that companies build into their product construction the amount of claims they're going to get sued for, so they allow for a margin of suing to take place. So that's already in the production. So they expect to be sued on certain levels of things. And the even worse thing, which I think the thing that really makes it completely unacceptable, is the companies buy off claimants with gagging orders. So there have been at least 30 claims that we know this has happened with fracking, where people have made complaints about contamination of water. They paid out like $750,000 to these people on condition they don't talk about it at all. So that totally contradicts the science thing. So on the one hand, you're saying that you're dependent on results and the evidence that shows. On the other hand, they're muffling the evidence. The corporations are actually preventing the evidence coming into the public domain. So that's completely skewed.
Yeah, and also, from my interpretation of it, correct me if I'm wrong here, but if the litigation is in process, it means the company can still keep trading until the decision's made. You made
That's a detail I don't know about, but
no, it's just you made that point that,
yes.
that this litigation can go on for up to, you said about 13 years in some cases.
Oh, well, that's on the other thing. That was on when corporations, when legislation comes up before an institution of parliamentary, and they can then scrutinise it, and they can then make little addendas and things to change it, or they can say, well, no, actually it wouldn't, and and they can also propose legislation as well. So corporations can propose legislation. I mean, I think this, again, is another example of this huge extension of corporate powers under these treaties.
Well, that's happening. We've covered that with the housing. What's going on here with Savills basically getting involved in writing legislation for the government, the estate agents.
Oh, right, have they?
Yeah, so basically, this to keep it quite simple, this is just a corporatisation of everything and a removal of rights, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so, I mean, it says right here, this is basically this is against TTIP, but maybe you could comment on this.
Right.
And let's know what you think. It says, these trade deals are lock-in international treaties by which our rights are signed away to American corporations. Regulations that protect us from corporations are degraded as barriers to trade. We've already covered that, haven't we? And corporations allowed to sue our governments, we've covered that, for anything that inhibits profits. CETA is a backdoor and softens the way for TTIP. And our government is complicit. So can you explain how that's being brought in?
Well, CETA started in 2009, TTIP in 2013, so it's been on the ball for much longer. It's none of the documents were available to the public on any level whatsoever, MPs or MEPs. Nobody saw any of it until it was released as a finished document.
They weren't allowed to take notes, I believe.
No, they weren't.
Yeah.
No. So it's been conducted in complete and utter secrecy. I think, as I opened before, it for various reasons, it's not been picked up on. I mean, partly because it's a much smaller economy, it's a less of a big deal, so people haven't got that excited about it. They thought Canada is more like Europe than America, and so people have been less worried about it.
Yeah.
But I mean, Canada, apart from the tar sands thing, okay, which is enormous, the danger to the world, it's going to put climate change beyond recovery. If the whole tar sands project goes through, it's a complete end. It could provoke irreversible climate damage. But it's not just that. It's become a mega industrial agricultural producer, Canada. So it's the third biggest producer of GMOs. And it has no food labelling regulations.
That's a very important point.
Yeah.
Because I think the GM aspect is the way to get the public on board. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Well, in Europe, we as a European Union has decided not to have GM in its food.
Yes.
That's due to huge opposition across Europe, including the UK. However, they're still banging away at the doors, so it's coming in via animal food. So, and the situation in this country, I think, is that now that we don't know whether food we're eating has been fed by animals with GMO food in it. We don't know. I think there are 2 supermarkets that are keeping control of that, but on the whole, it's not. So we don't know. But it's not going directly into our food.
Well, we're eating the animals that are eating the GM.
Yes. Yeah. And it's going into oil.
Yeah.
So most of the takeaway food, happily go and get your kebab or your chicken, will have been fried in oil with GM in it.
Yeah. It's a big problem in America.
Well, so 70%. So 70% over there, GM is directly in the food supply.
Yeah.
So
to give people a bit of perspective on this and what could happen here is that Monsanto got sued by a farmer over there. He actually won, but basically they've got patents and on all the wheat. So the GM wheat, when it infects other crops, is an infringement of their copyright.
Right.
It's quite unbelievable, but those are the sort of laws we're talking about, aren't they? Here?
They are, and they also did that with rice as well. There was a huge, and thank God, something called the Seed Rice Intensification Program has had a huge impact by having an alternative way to grow rice, using organic seeds and taking them on from one generation to the other, rather than trying to force farmers to have to buy each year seed from Monsanto. And the other big thing about the Monsanto position is that their seeds are genetically modified to withstand the effects of the enormous, horrible pesticides they put on the food. So it's encouraging pesticide use. It isn't actually reducing it. Sometimes it's kind of described as this great Hail Mary solution, because it means the crops can withstand all these diseases. But in fact, there's just as much chemical spraying as ever going on. So.
And this does open the door for Monsanto to sue our government if we don't accept their products, basically.
That's the kind of problem.
Yeah.
That's why the ISDS thing is so important to realise, and with the NHS and with other things, that things that you might think are safe on one portion of the treaty is undermined by the fact that corporations can use IDS to further their own agendas.
That's the investor-state dispute settlement, which uses non-domestic jurisdiction, which we covered in the first part of the show, with the arbitrators, which are 3 lawyers, the company and the state. So there is no duty for them to use the domestic jurisdiction. I think that's the main thing to get over, is that the laws of the country basically get thrown out of the window, and they can use international law and also any law that they can get their hands on, basically.
At the moment, it's about to be voted on by the Council of Ministers.
Right.
That is all the heads of states of all the member states, 28 member states. There is a huge fight going on because the Malmstrom and the EU want the EU to have the competence to just sign it off. The member states would wish that each member state can ratify it separately. That's called mixity. Yeah. And that is causing such a struggle at the moment. This meeting was supposed to sign off at the end of June. I have heard that Malmström's now talking about July. A sort of fly in the ointment is that it's all been taken to the European Court of Justice to decide this, finally, whether it is one kind of agreement or another. But that won't take place till November. That's after the Council of Ministers will have decided. So how this can be reconciled, I don't know, because they're being asked to sign a treaty where they don't know what the process of ratification fully is. And the member state governments want it to be ratified individually. This means that each member state can vote on whether they accept it. If, as far as I understand it, if one refuses, then it's out. There again, they're trying to attack that. There is a system called qualified majority voting in the Council of Ministers, but it doesn't apply to trade treaties. It has to be unanimous.
Yeah.
And the Commission is trying to chip away at that, I've heard. But one of the other things I think the public really should know about is that this country does not have the right to veto a treaty. And that is not an EU regulation. It's this country's own constitutional decision. So there was an act in 2010 which described the relationship between Parliament and trade treaties, and in that act it says it has to have public scrutiny for 21 days before Parliament, but nothing further. So there isn't even a debate guaranteed, and there isn't a vote. If it should come to a debate and there's a vote against it, what that means is it is then blocked. And in that period, then the government can bring back the same trade treaty and put it forward again, and then it goes through the same process. So I've seen a letter from Francis Moore, the previous Trade Commissioner, saying it would just be a case of indefinite blocking. Well, you can imagine how difficult that might be to sustain over a long period. So we don't have the right to say no. We can only block it. We can only say yes, or we can block it.
We can't put an absolute no.
No,
on
we
it.
can't veto it.
No.
And that's the position that this UK government chose in 2010.
How would Brexit come into this?
How would it affect CETA?
Yeah.
Well, I think that is very interesting. I did a bit of research on this, and it would seem to me that leaving the EU takes 2 years to at least of negotiation. Within that period, CETA will be signed off, at least. I mean, if it goes according to their plan, it will be signed by the Council of Ministers and it will be signed by Parliament. It wouldn't be ratified necessarily. Okay. So you think we might be out of it?
Well, we won't, but
we won't, because while we're still in it, which we are, we would still be subject to any laws going on in Europe. I mean, we're not suddenly out of Europe. It's a 2-year process. So, okay, then you might start arguing, oh yes, but we haven't ratified it. But unfortunately, when you do trade treaties, you sign to them jointly and severally. And what this means is that you've agreed it both as an individual member state, but also as part of the EU.
Yes.
And since then they might argue, yes, but okay, but the elements in the treaty that are member state ratification, we haven't signed for that. We have signed for the EU competence. Well, unfortunately, with CETA, 90% of it is EU competence, including the ISDS chapter. Now, what this means is that, okay, for the next 2 years, any investments made under the treaty will be covered by it. Furthermore, when you then terminate yourself from the treaty, and as far as I understand that, you have to give notice to leave a treaty. You can't just leave it, because obviously it upsets so many partners' calculations about it. So it'll probably take 3 to 4 years. So I think even if we left, we'd be signed up to it as EU members. We'd have to start now saying we want out of CETA. That would take probably about 3 years. But then there's a sunset clause. It's called the stabilisation clause. That's the official language, but we tend to call it so, which means that the investments that are made within the time of that treaty remain in force for another 20 years. 20 years. So if anyone had invested in the health service in the next 3 years, and then our government, say a nice, friendly, pro-NHS government came into power and wanted to renationalise it, so it wouldn't be able to. because of the ratchet clause in these things. It's an important thing that the extent to which a thing is already privatised, you can't turn it back. That's the level at which it's accepted. And there's another thing actually about that we haven't mentioned is the negative list, which is worse in CETA than in TTIP. The negative list means that all services are included unless they're excluded.
Right, so they have to opt out.
Yeah. Previously it used to be if it was in, if people put it in. But that also means future services. So if you start a new service on, say, kidney transplant or heart donors or something, you start some new service or some service we can't even imagine now, some genetic sort of treatment, it would be excluded automatically because it wasn't present in the treaty.
Okay, Tim, we're going to have to leave it there, but what can we do about it? Who can we get in touch with? And there's the websites to go to. Okay,
so one of the main attempts at the moment is to demand from Cameron that he agrees to give MPs in the UK Parliament the vote on CETA, so that he can't just get away with just giving it 21 days public scrutiny, but there is a proper vote and debating procedure on it. And also we're trying to campaign against the provisional implementation. That's something which we didn't discuss, but it means that if CETA is passed by the European Parliament, it gets provisionally implemented immediately. So the Dutch Parliament is now saying it doesn't want that. So we'd like that to occur with the UK Parliament saying we don't want provisional implementation. So there are various things we can do to fight against it. So we're trying to stop it at the Council of Ministers level. We're trying to stop it being provisionally implemented, and then we'll be trying to influence MEPs to vote against it. So there are about 3 different stages which we can fight against it. Now the 2 NGOs who are mainly involved at the moment with petitions, you can go and sign online, A War on Want and Global Justice Now. They've got petitions up and running, and then so you can go on those websites and you'll see petitions to demand not provisional implementation and for the right for MPs to vote on it. Then there is a third one coming into play this week called CETA Check, which is organised by stopttip.org, which is the European version of Stop TTIP, which is the one that launched the European Citizens Initiative. We've got 3.2 million people saying no to TTIP and to CETA.
Seen that one, yeah.
Same lot,
yeah.
And they started one against CETA, so that's coming online. And also I've heard there's an early day motion being launched about, I think, provisional implementation in Parliament. So there are a lot of things going on. People are really waking up to the danger of CETA. We got onto it in a way too late for various reasons we've already discussed. But everyone really needs to start informing each other. And I think the great thing is this, is that I think people more or less understand what TTIP is. You just have to say CETA is TTIP's evil twin.
TTIP is the US and EU transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which is coming in soon, and CETA is pretty much here already, and that's the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. Negotiations are completed and it's all ready and it's in the finalising process, so get busy, get off your sofas, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks to Windows on the World.
Keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World, and we'll see you soon.